So in this event, we'll be focusing on two interesting aspects of the API development lifecycle, prototyping and automated SDK generation. To be highly productive while designing a new API, you want to get it into the hands of its consumers as quickly as possible so that they can start to build in parallel and provide early feedback on its design. The idea is that by doing this, you could enable rapid iteration toward an API that provides the best developer experience for its users. So today, we're going to explore how to do that. We've brought in an expert in each area to demonstrate one part of this whole process. First, we'll feature Dan Perovich, Head of Sales Engineering and Customer Success at WireMock, for a walkthrough on API prototyping. Next, Cameron Steele, Solutions Engineer at Liblab, will demonstrate how to take this artifact and generate helpful software development kits, or SDKs. After that, we'll open things up for a Q&A. So for those of you tuning in live, just please write in your questions into the chat throughout the event, and I'll try to keep a log on that, and we'll take it all after these two presentations. So thanks a lot for being with us, Dan, and feel free to start your screens whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here with everybody. And we should be looking at a title slide here. Great, thanks for the confirmation. So hey everyone, Dan Perovich, based out of the Washington, D.C. area. Great to be here with you all today. Going to talk to you first in the first section here about unlocking that parallel development using a mock-first prototyping approach. So when we think about API design today, right, there's a lot of different ways that APIs are designed or potentially designed in quotes, right? And teams look at this in various different ways. So they think about doing too much design up front as adding too much time to the process and too much effort, right? And they just want to get going. Maybe that's a mandate from management just to get something going, a minimal viable product. So this oftentimes gets short-circuited. But because of that, we wind up getting feedback a lot later and causing a bunch of rework if we don't put just a little bit of effort into doing that design up front and just not running by the skin of our teeth, right? And even no matter which way we go, those APIs drift as we move forward, as we try and get our consuming team and our producing team moving at the same speed and not waiting upon one another. We still wind up having this drift, and we need to solve for that the most effective way possible to keep this a benefit rather than a detriment. Right, and I already mentioned that in API design today, oftentimes the producing team is still doing their work before the consuming team can do anything. So we've got this waterfall style of development still, even though we've been battling those battles for a while to try and parallelize this stuff. So, there's this camp of, designing the spec first as well. But a lot of times, again, if we design too much of the spec up front and don't have the right tooling and approaches to handle these rapid changing, then again, we wind up being a little bit in a pickle and maybe it wind up being detrimental to us. So, why aren't teams doing just rapid prototyping, trying to get ahead of this today, right? It's often seen as expensive. Again, maybe there's a mandate from management to just get a minimal viable product. We'll figure it out as we go along. Agile methodology comes to mind here, right? The spec first approach is often seen as a good enough substitute where we just design a document and we write it out and then we use that, but we actually haven't put anything into practice to see if it's going to work just yet. Teams often get overconfident in their designs, believing that, hey, we've got it nailed the first time around, so we don't need to prototype anything. We don't need to actually try calling this from the consumer to see if it actually is going to meet the business needs or not. So we've got that overconfidence factor. And This is often seen as being easier with front end than with APIs and back end services. So, front end teams might do more of this prototyping because it really enables them to get going faster and not wait on the producer to deliver. But in a true microservices world where we have APIs calling APIs, we still see a lot of this prototyping not happening. So that's where we come up with the approach of mock first prototyping. And mock first prototyping is an approach where we can collaboratively design the API using examples of, if we send in this should come back, right? Working by examples like we typically would have done anyway on a whiteboard, and then tried to transpose that into documentation, and then both teams all go off and start working. But if we actually use a mocking tool or platform, we can walk out of such a design meeting with assets that both teams can utilize. So coming out of a mock first design and prototyping session, the consuming team gets delivered an endpoint that they can start to make calls from the consumer against and get lifelike responses of what's going to be developed by the producing team. So they instantly get to start calling on this service, even though that it's not delivered yet. And then we get faster feedback from that consuming team as they start to build their business logic and consuming this API. They can rapidly flush out any deficiencies that we didn't see during that prototyping and design phase. And this API spec that can automatically be generated by many tools like WireMock can then be iterated upon by the consuming team and the producing team, and used to rapidly generate assets such as SDKs, as we'll see today, documentation for developer portals, and then decorated with additional capabilities such as authentication, and fed back into our mocking framework so the consuming team can make use of these changes as soon as possible. All of this leads to less surprises late in the feature release cycle here. So at this point, I'll just take maybe about 5 more minutes here and show you just what something, an approach like this mock first prototyping and API design looks like with a short demo here. So go ahead and get this started.
We're going to use WireMock Cloud to demonstrate how we can take a mock first approach when designing and developing a new API. So we're here in WireMock Cloud, and we're going to start out with a rather blank OpenAPI definition file, simply calling out the title version and the endpoint of this service. And we'll see this change rather quickly as we start to build the mocks inside of our stubbing platform. So we'll do that here. We'll go ahead and create a few examples. Our first one will be to get contact one. It'll be a get on the contact endpoint, and it's going to require a contact ID be passed in on the path. And by example, if the contact ID is equal to 1, we're going to respond with a status code of 200, a content type header of application JSON, and the body will be here. Contact one, first name, Dan, last name, Perovich. So we're simply working by example, providing examples of what this new service should do when it receives various different requests. So maybe a get contact 2 will have a slightly different type of response body. Again, a 200, it'll still be JSON, and a get for contact 2 might return an organization. So the fundamental design choice here during our prototyping stage is that if a contact is a member of an organization, it will be returned in the response body. But if that contact is not a member of an organization, that attribute will be left out of the response body. Now we can continue our rapid prototyping and mock first approach by adding some post conditions. So let's go ahead and do create contact 3. This will be a path of contact. This is going to be a post in this sense. And then the body of this type of post, as an example, will look like this. So simply passing in a first name and a last name in the post body will result in a status code of 201, again returning application JSON payload, and then the sample response body for the create contact 3. And we'll just quickly change this to text here and save one more time. We'll clone this and we'll come up and do our create contact 4 just as another example in our post body. This will be slightly different again. This is showcasing the addition of the organization attribute when creating this Betty Boop contact. And then we can come down and adjust our response body for contact 4, and we'll save that. Now, simply by providing these examples of this request will generate this response and doing this a few different times, we've automatically generated an open API schema or contract for this new API. So coming out of this rapid design session, the producing team now has an open API contract that they can feed into their SDK generators or even into their IDEs to generate the code scaffolding to start to fill in the business logic. We can then go ahead and even push this into our source code control, GitHub in this case, and we'll see very quickly upon refreshing our GitHub project here that that open API contract has now been pushed into our source code control so that other tools may be able to leverage it at this time. Now, important to note is that all this work that we've done has also stood up a mock API. So the consuming team coming out of this rapid design session meeting now has a real endpoint that they can start to develop against. So I'll just use my browser tab here and we'll make a call to get contact 1, and we can see that Dan Perovich comes back, and we can do our get for contact 2 and see that Tom comes back as part of the marketing organization. From here, I'm going to hand it off to Cameron, who will now be able to demonstrate how we can take this to the next step and generate the SDK automatically from this rapid prototyping session and open API schema file that was automatically generated for us.
All right, so let me share my screen. All right, so welcome to our section on SDK generation for your API. My name is Cameron Steele. I'm an engineer here at Liblab. So in the last session, as we just saw, Dan quickly prototyped an API using WireMock Cloud. So now what? Your API is only really valuable if people use it. In order to use your API, developers have to learn how to use it. Per Stack Overflow's latest developer survey, they showed the #1 way that devs learn how to use an API is through reference documentation and SDKs. Your API is really only as good as its SDK. When your API is the product, your developer experience is pretty much largely defined by that SDK that you're providing, which is why I say that. Your API really is truly only as good as your SDK. Diving a little bit deeper, we can see from this slide that a great developer experience is multifaceted, and there's a ton of factors involved. You need documentation, you need to provide your spec, SDKs, documentation for those SDKs, code snippets, embedding those into some kind of developer portal, providing it properly on different package managers, building tutorials, building interactive snippets. All of those things are big parts of building this great developer experience. And as you can see, SDKs, SDK generation tools really help fill in these gaps. As you can see in this chart, we showed the different things that a lot of these tools will provide. So why doesn't every API have an SDK if they're so important? It comes down to development cost, time, and difficulty of producing great SDKs. The development cost is high because of the complexities involved with producing something that's really high quality. It really takes a while to produce these SDKs, especially when you're doing things across different languages and making sure that there's features that your customer base cares about. And then maintaining them when your API change really adds a whole nother level of complexity. From personal experience, as someone who's created a ton of production-ready SDKs, and creating them idiomatically is mostly a nightmare, especially when you have to go back and maintain them, especially if you have a small team that really only knows a couple of different languages. There are a ton of different SDK generation tools out there that allow you to automate the creation and maintenance of your SDKs. Many of them also allow you to automatically generate snippets and documentations automatically. Luckily, we live in a world where friends shouldn't let friends manually build their SDKs. So this is typically the anatomy of a generation tool. You have your two main inputs. Sometimes there's more. You have your OpenAPI spec, or maybe a Postman spec, something that defines the structure of your API. Then you have your configuration input. This is the names of your services. This is the name of the artifacts that you generate, things about auth, or literally anything that would customize your SDK. You throw it into this usually black box system that will then spit out your different artifacts in the different languages, and then accompanying documentation for those. To give a more concrete example, I'm going to show you how we at Liblab would build an SDK for the API that Dan just created with WireMock Cloud. I apologize if the audio is a little off, but please bear with me. All right, so I'll be showing you how we generate SDKs with the Liblab CLI. Before you can start, you need to make sure you have Liblab. So you can go to npm install-g Liblab. I already have it installed, so I don't need to do anything. And the first command that we're going to run is liblab init, and we're going to pass the spec. And in this case, I copied the raw URL of the spec that Dan provided, and we're going to enter that. What this will do is generate a liblab config file. So this is where you will put all the different configuration options. You can specify the language. I'm going to go through it one by one. So first, I'm going to call this WireMock demo SDK. And this is a contact API. As you can see, the spec file path is set. And right now, I just want to generate Python and TypeScript. So by default, it tries to fill in some different auth stuff. We don't need any of that because there is no authentication in this SDK. I'm also going to enable the dev container flag. This will ship our SDKs with dev containers that make it really easy to get started, even if you have no Python or none of the native tools needed to work with the SDK. It makes it really nice. Then I'm going to go down to the Python and TypeScript language options. I'm going to give it a PyPy name. I'm just going to call it WireMock demo. And for TypeScript, I'll do the same thing, WireMock demo. Okay. There's nothing else I really need to configure. There is a lot to configure, but this is all we need at the moment. So now I'm going to run liblab build, and what this will do is generate the SDK. Now you'll see an error. This is totally fine. It's just saying, hey, your spec is a little light or it has some problems and it might not be production ready. This is totally okay. We're going to say, don't worry about it. But we will have a output file that describes these issues if we want to go back, polish it up, or work backwards and clean up our pipeline, or however we generate this spec file. And as you can see, everything has been generated. So I'm going to switch over to the Python SDK. You can see it's right here. I'm going to open it in a new VS Code window with that dev container. Switch over to it. Okay, so we are inside this dev container. Automatically, it will install all the dependencies and set up Python. So out of the box, you're ready to go. We also have this handy examples file, this examples folder with a number of dependencies and all the setup files you need. And here you go. This is out of the box what you get with a sample. It just chooses one of the endpoints that is easy to see and sets up all of the imports, everything you need to start playing. So by default, we see this get contact by contact ID, and it has a single parameter, contact ID. We can fill it in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the docs that we generate automatically. These are in Markdown. And I'm going to go down to service. I'm going to find the contact service. And I'm going to render this so we can see it. And out of the box, we have these snippets and examples of everything you want to do. There's only two methods in this service. There is the get contact and the create contact. So we could just copy and paste these into that sample file if we wanted to get started quickly. So we already have this basically in the sample file, so I have no need to copy it, but this will describe everything that you need to do. So in this case, let's call sample or the contact ID of 1, which there should be data as you saw in the earlier demo. And we're just going to print out the result. So I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to run Python example sample.py, and we can see we get Dan. He's our first contact. We can do some different things with it. You can do whatever you want in an application, but in this case, I can say result.contact ID, first name, last name, or organization. All of these are just exposed to us and available. So we could do a nice template where we say a nice message or something. As you can see, though, organization is here, but it doesn't show up here. It's an optional value in the API, so you see it, but it is optional. So nothing happens when we call it. Next, we can go about creating a new contact. So I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to go back to this service documentation. I'm going to find this snippet. And what we do here is we use the post contact request class, and it will walk us through constructing a new contact. In this case, you can see Betty Boop in finance, and then we call the post contact. So let's do that right now. I'm just going to copy all of this, go back to our sample, I'm going to overwrite this, and this is a mock API that we are going to be calling, so nothing's actually going to get saved, but we will get the request saying that it succeeded. So let's try running this now. I'm just going to run the same command, and we get the post contact created response model back. It automatically serializes the data. We see that we're given a contact ID for first name, last name, the organization, and the created timestamp. And that's really about it. You've, from 0 to hero, created an SDK in Python, and it only took a couple of minutes. This same process can be used in CI/CD. We have a number of different actions that can be integrated, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. All right, and hopefully you were able to hear that. And now we're going to move on to talking about CI/CD. Let me move to this next slide. Okay, so this is an example of how workflows work typically in a GitHub CI/CD pipeline. We have what we call a control repo. You can see it right here. And this stores all of the state of the code generator This will include the configuration file, any customizations, sometimes the spec, sometimes you'll keep the spec in some other repo or something. But every time something updates, you could set it up to be anytime the spec updates, if there's a push to another repo, if you have some other like an API repo that has some kind of deployment process, any of those things could call your control repo and say, hey, I'm ready to generate a new SDK. And from there, it will go about running it, and it will create different, it'll create pull requests in the different repositories of your language SDKs. So you can keep those available to the public. You can do whatever you want with those. You can set up your own custom linting or modifications, and those will ultimately also hold your release processes that will deploy them to places like PyPy or NuGet or NPM, depending on whatever language you are working with. And this is all super easy. Usually there are actions that you can clone, super easy to set up, and it will scaffold all of this tooling. You don't need to be an expert in CI/CD, and this will work in a number of different environments, not just GitHub Actions. So in summary, by enhancing your developer experience with SDKs for your API, you're benefiting your organization by increasing developer adoption. You're benefiting your developers because they get to spend time on the core product and not maintenance. And you benefit your customers by reducing the onboarding time so they can get building quick. With that, I will kick it back over to Bill for the Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Cameron. Really smooth handoffs between the presentations and really smooth, tech working together in synchrony. So very cool. We have some Q&A questions coming through. Adam, I think, was the first to chime in, who I know has some perspectives on the open API tooling landscape. He mentioned, this one's for Dan, folks start with a spec-based design, like writing an open API doc rather than implementation, due to the need to go quickly and deliver features and such. And he says, I found that the overwhelming advice from the open API community is to start with the spec. Is that advice dated? Or in what situations would one prefer starting with a spec, starting with a mock, or starting with the implementation? Kind of a loaded
Great
concept. Yeah.
That's a great question. So no, I don't think it's dated. And in fact, a mock first approach is really kind of just a bolt on to a spec first approach. And what we've found and what I've heard from talking to a lot of customers is spec first is hard. It's writing in an open API spec format is just, it's not a programming language. It's YAML or it's JSON, and you're trying to describe things in still a nascent way or format, and it's maybe just not that easy to think that way and start by fingers to keys and creating that document. So if you have a tool like the one I demonstrated today in WireMock Cloud, where you deal with requests and responses that you're used to seeing, right, and you're used to parsing and feeding into your SDKs and serializing them with that, that's just an easier way for a lot of people to think. If I pass this into the new service, I should get this back. I don't care how we got from that request to that response. We'll fill in that business logic later, but the starting at the beginning and the result of what should come back is just a natural process. And if you have a tool that can then convert that into the beginnings of your open API spec, you've kind of just bolted on to spec first there. Now, I think the last part of that question is implementation first. There's still times for that. You got to go really fast. I guess there's a mandate and there's pushback from upper management. I think maybe that's where that still comes into play. But hopefully we've seen that we can get to true parallelizing of development pretty quickly, because just delivering that API and designing the API first still has the consuming team sitting on their hands. So it'd be a great experiment to run in parallel if we could figure out the scientific method to have team 1 and 2 take a mock based approach and see who delivers, as opposed to 3 and 4 who did implementation first, because there's no parallelization in implementation first. So don't really have a good answer for that one, but hopefully the rest of the answer was what you were looking for there, Adam.
Awesome. Yeah, really great question, because I was wondering something similar during your talk. I was like, is this going against the design first approach that the API community is so into advocating, or is it like an add-on, as you say, kind of bolting onto the spec first approach? So yeah, very interesting. Yeah, Cameron, do you have any thoughts there on how this might like complement the spec first attitude and what the end benefits are?
Yeah, I mean, everything that's already been said is great. We've definitely found that even mocking and having an SDK, we found that a lot of people will use these tools and they'll just start they'll start running wild, building different prototypes. Different teams are completely unblocked, and it really makes it a more asynchronous process. And yeah, we do a lot of that internally. We work with a lot of customers who do that. And yeah, it's a great process. And I've definitely been at companies where it's like, oh, we have to wait for this API change before we can update the front end or all this. And it causes gridlock. And that's just money that you're burning because everyone's just sitting around.
Yeah, totally. And when we pitched this idea of the LiveCast, we were talking about how it like enables rapid iteration, that parallel development. Could this help like support multiple API versions simultaneously going through this kind of process, you think? Because I know a lot of teams are having to do that right now, when they're deprecating features and such.
I'll take a stab. Bill, so yeah, absolutely. A lot of the mocking frameworks, or some of them, I know at least WireMock Cloud, where I'm the expert, as that's where I spend my days. This is a very common theme because you can blend with a enterprise worthy tool both mock responses and live responses. So depending on how you're going about your versioning, maybe you're just adding some new paths to an existing API, or you're changing the paths with the version number in the path. All of these would be supported, but with the right tooling, you can have a mock endpoint that blends both live responses with mocked responses coming out of it, and then feeding that into the SDK generator, right? That's backed, calling that mock. Now you have a blending of net new functionality, net new paths that are being responded to by the mock while they're still being built by the producing team. And all of your legacy or your older version paths are being responded to by the live endpoint. So you can continue to make sure that nothing is breaking and that backwards compatibility is maintained across the versions.
Right. While allowing front-end developers just to continue building and getting those clients together.
Absolutely.
Cool.
And something I can add to that is a huge use case that we really don't talk about a lot publicly is that people generate SDKs for a lot of internal just testing. And when you have all these different versions, it can be hard because a lot of developers can find themselves siloed in the back end or the front end, and you kind of lose some of the empathy for the other teams that will be consuming. And being able to just spin out a bunch of different test versions of the SDK and pass them along, whether it's versions or you're trying out different, you have different models or objects in their different structures. It's awesome to be able to just send that over to a bunch of different teams and get feedback immediately. It's like, no, we actually need an endpoint that can look up this specific object by this ID or this special, filter or something. And it really helps close the loop on some of the things that make the product work better or more efficiently.
Gotcha. Well, I personally have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure we get through the Q&A first. Ethan Jones is asking, what types of APIs are supported with Liblab and WireMock? So I'm assuming they're talking about like REST versus GraphQL or gRPC, or I don't know, and you can interpret that how you might. But well, yeah, what would be supported in this like handoff that we've showed today? What do you both support?
I'll take it first, Cameron, just to go with the flow that we've been going with. So today, WireMock Cloud specifically supports HTTP HPS services first and foremost. So that's RESTful, XML, SOAP XML, also just plain text and MIME types, right? So if you have base64 encoded file exchanges, we can support that as well. We also support GraphQL, as GraphQL over the wire is just a JSON payload after all. And gRPC will be coming out in the very near future here, eminently in the next couple of days. We'll be releasing that. So that's an exciting advancement, as there's still a lot of gRPC communication going on out there.
Totally. What about on the Liblab side of things, Cameron?
Yeah, from our end, as inputs, we support OpenAPI, older versions of Swagger and Postman. We're even working with supporting Arazo, which is new workflow standards by the OpenAPI group. In terms of protocols, we currently only support REST and JSON. We are actively experimenting with different things, but our goal right now is to just finely tune that segment. We do support all the MIME types and different application types. XML is a little less, but we're getting ready to probably expand into some additional ones. I know that there's a lot of pain points in SOAP and some of those other ones that don't really have silver bullets. But GraphQL and gRPC and MQTT and all these other protocols are something that's on our radar, but at the moment we're trying to provide the best experience for REST.
Nice. So I imagine you're definitely following all the like different specifications that are being put to market, since a lot of this is spec based. Are you guys following the async API specification, and how does that, if so, how does that kind of play into the products?
So I can't speak a ton for product roadmaps, but yeah, the async API is something that we've been tracking a lot internally. It's really cool for building those. It's kind of like messaging, brokers, pub sub, all those things. But again, our bread and butter at the moment is REST services, but hopefully in the near future, we can start to support all kinds of different APIs and bringing it into one cohesive SDK to provide the best SDK you could possibly have.
Nice. Dan, Cameron talked about Arazo, the new workflows specification for OpenAPI. I'm curious if WireMock is looking into that, and how that even would be transferred into this like visual based editor of like composing workflows and such.
Yeah, great question. One that I don't have an answer for you.
Yeah, it's all good,
Bill.
It's so new.
I apologize there, but definitely something we can follow up with you personally about, and we can get the message out in the future. Would love to have our CTO and the original creator of the WireMock project, Tom, really comment on and get his thoughts around that.
Sounds great. Adam had one more question for us, just asking Cameron if any of the Liblab tech you demoed is open source.
So at the moment, we don't have anything open sourced, but we do have a free tier. Anyone can sign up, and I believe you get 10 free generations. You can use the one that we build straight into the init process. You can generate that one as many times as you want, just to kind of get a feel for what we do. But then, yeah, you can generate 10 of your own SDKs. You can always contact us if you have some use case where you want to try some other things. I'm sorry, it's 5 generations per month that you get for free. It used to be that you would get 10 flat, but now it's 5 per month. So You get to see as we release new features, and you can try things like the new Arazo workflow generation. But if you are working on an open source project, or we have some special conditions, we can give you access for free. You just have to contact us either via email, or you can always join our Discord server. But not open source at the moment. That is something that we're considering, but we have a pretty good payment tiers, and you're always, as a hobbyist or an open source contributor, always welcome to come and explore, ask us questions, and if you have a use case, we're happy to figure something out that's beneficial from both of us.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds pretty helpful to at least get started and ask around for more questions. I'm curious, Raj asked how Liblab is different from OpenAPI SDK generator. I mean, there's so many SDK generators now on the market. It's not just that one that Raj mentioned. Yeah, maybe like what makes Liblab unique compared to everything out there right now?
So we love to say that we're living in kind of a renaissance era of SDK generation. There are a ton of awesome tools out there. He asked specifically for OpenAPI generator. I can kind of talk about that. Specifically, OpenAPI generator is a tool. It's not really a full software as a service. You get it. It is open source. You can tweak it if you want. But at the end of the day, if you have problems or something doesn't work, it's on you to maintain it, or to donate to sponsor it, or make a pull request, or ask someone in a discussion. You really don't get any kind of SLA. That is something that we're really happy to offer. We're also all about customer customizations and delivering new features. Very often we have customers coming through saying, no other tool supports this. This is a weird niche use case. How can we get it done? And we have a very quick turnaround of deploying new features and allowing people to just deeply customize where they're at. We have a great team of very professional and skilled engineers who know OpenAPI like the back of their hand, and we love to work with people. Even if they have maybe a subpar API, we go through and audit it. We give them a lot of recommendations. Sometimes things are just kind of weird, and we can provide middle tooling that allows you to automatically transfer your API or your API spec in a way. We provide bundling, so if you have 15 different disparate APIs, we can bring it all into one. And we provide documentation and walkthroughs for every aspect from creating your spec to deploying it live to your package manager. So it's all about building a partnership with the companies and projects we work with.
Yeah. I mean, open source is great, but like you said, the lack of SLAs and long-term stability for those kind of projects that, sometimes has people going for the more software as a service route.
And one other thing to note is that any dependencies that we do ship with SDKs, we are monitoring that. We work with third-party vendors that do security audits. You'll never really get into a situation where maybe some downstream dependency gets hijacked, or you find that it's using like is even or things like that you really have no control over when you're generating. We try to keep low dependency, and any dependency we audit, sometimes even work with the teams that develop those to make sure that everything is good.
Awesome. Well, I'm curious about the role of low code or visual based approaches to both the prototyping and SDK generation side of things. Like I see both of you are using a little bit of both sides, hard coding and like low code or visual based programming. What type of developer might find that more visual based style more appealing and fitting into their workflows? Maybe we could kick it off with Dan.
Yeah, good question. So First and foremost, a tool like I showcased, WireMock Cloud is an API first tool. So it's WireMock Cloud is a SaaS offering built on top of the widely popular WireMock open source framework and Java tool that's been out for numerous years, which is a code first approach, right? And yeah, a lot of developers are like using that, but as we kind of progress a little bit later stage SDLC and solving for these dependency challenges, right? We're going back to the spaghetti web diagram that we tried to get rid of with the enterprise service buses. And now we've got more connections than ever. The expanded population that can get value out of these tools and the parallelization of these efforts is greater, and they're not all developers, or they're junior and they want a UI experience to click around and view and manage. There's also a large number of enterprises have these developer productivity teams, and these teams often take management and ownership of these tools and roll them out to the developer groups. And a lot of times the people on those centralized teams and center of excellences, they're not true hardcore developers and really want to use the UIs to manage and advertise to the various teams that these services exist for developers to use and gain the benefits out of. So that management plane of a centralized service and offering in developer productivity tooling organizations typically appreciate the more point and click style of approach of developing and maintaining these types of assets.
Yeah, Cameron, do you notice more people interested in the point and click approach to SDK generation, or do they want something that's more like, automated into their Git flows and YAML based?
Yeah, so I haven't really heard a lot of customers asking for tooling that helps build it in a more UI approach. I'm sure there are tools out there that can help you visualize your OpenAPI specs in a more UI centric way. We don't really provide any of that, but anything that speaks OpenAPI or Postman or any of these other specs that we will eventually be supporting will just work, and it will work in if you have a server in your closet at your office that runs all of your critical infrastructure. You could just use the CLI there. You could use it in like GitLab pipelines or GitHub Actions. But it's kind of an interesting way you could take this question. I think I would like to is not just from the creation of the SDK, but from the consumption of the API of the SDK. There's a lot of really cool both open source and commercial tools that allow you to visually connect different APIs together. You've seen like Node-RED and 88N and Zapier and tools like that. Something that we don't really talk about, and something I'm actually writing a blog post about soon, is how you can integrate with those tools using an SDK that we provide. Because I think developers, there is a place for low code for developers who are authoring these APIs, but I think we really want to have empathy for the end users, and a lot of those people aren't engineers. A lot of people use Zapier because they want to automate their business. They're probably solo entrepreneurs, even all the way up to big enterprise customers. It's really cool how easily you can take like an API that we generate or any of these tools can generate, and then you can hook them up using just a few lines of code or using some documentation. I know Node-RED and N8N are super easy to integrate, and we've done some prototypes with that. But SDKs can allow you to bridge in all of these other tools, so you can really cast a wide net for how people can consume them.
Cameron, I remembered something in your presentation. You said that maintaining idiomatic language-specific SDKs can really turn into a nightmare. Is there like a specific coding language or platform where it's like especially challenging if you don't have a tool like this? Or is it just similarly hard across all languages?
So it depends on resources.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of times that I've worked on solo projects or hackathons or just like my own open source projects where we had customers or our users coming in and saying, "Hey, we want to integrate it, but we don't know Python or we don't know TypeScript or whatever the native approach that we provided." And if you're one person, I mean, you might know many different languages, but it's really hard to be an expert in all of those languages. So in the past, when you had SDKs spanning a large number of languages, you would usually need at least one engineer who was an expert in that language to develop it. And they have to spend a lot of time, following trends of the language. They need to make sure it's idiomatic. They have to set up linting. They have to set up all the intricacies. Sometimes you have to use like certain dependencies to do validation or retry logic. And it's just a lot. It's just so many different fronts you have to put eyes and ears on, and you have to spend money maintaining. And for a large enterprise company that has hundreds or thousands of employees, probably not a big deal. But when you're a startup of 2 or 3 engineers, there's no way that you can maintain all of those SDKs while still shipping core products and selling and doing everything that is involved with SaaS or even traditional companies that provide APIs.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, we've kind of gone through all the Q&A questions and personal questions I had for both of you. I figured maybe we could open the floor just saying like, are there any new features you guys are excited about, whether it's WireMock Cloud or Liblab? Anything on the horizon that you're looking forward to within, the product or your communities? Dan, you want to kick that off?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, always excited about what's right around the corner, what came out recently. So, as I was mentioning in my last answer, there's definitely a large audience for, using mock endpoints, and it's just not developers in the early cycles of new development of consumer producer. There's all types of dependencies mocks are used for, especially third-party reliability and such. One of the latest features that we released was full stateful mocking. So, a lot of times what happens when you start to rely on a mocking framework to solve some of your challenges is you do posts and you do different changes that you're expecting to pull back that change with a future get or something. So think of an account balance, right? Every account should maintain its own balance, and especially when you're dealing with sandboxes, you want to be able to maintain these states of things. So we've recently released full stateful mocking, which allows you to keep state of different objects, whether that's JSON blobs, account balances, strings, mimes, you name it. You can now do that inside of WireMock Cloud. We've also recently introduced data sources, which allows you to seed your mock APIs with a large set of data for doing request matching and response building. So instead of having 10,000 stubs for 10,000 different accounts, you can have one stub with a 10,000 row data source attached to it that knows how to respond to every one of those account numbers or so forth. So that's exciting. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, gRPC is right around the corner. We're opening that up into some private beta customers this week, and should be looking to roll that out, to a GA standpoint in just a matter of a handful of weeks here, if it even takes that long. So that'll be rather exciting. As I mentioned, gRPC is still very healthy and very widely used, especially in fintech, and we're excited to solve those challenges for our customers.
Awesome. Yeah, Cameron, anything else we'd want to mention that we haven't already covered?
Yeah, so we've touched on a few things. The biggest thing is workflows using the Arazo spec. We recently put out a tutorial and blog post walking you through creating one of those specs and then generating a workflow SDK that incorporates the different steps into single methods and how you integrate those with existing SDKs. Actually, I made a video where I walk through that. So it's super cool to see. We also recently released our Liblab Hub, which is a platform where you can view a bunch of different SDKs that we support in our documentation to kind of see it live and how it looks. We're every day we're pushing new features and improving things, but we recently made big strides in our PHP language support. It's been a lot of fun working on PHP and getting that really nice and easy to work with. PHP is one of those languages that will outlive us all and probably outlive a lot of other languages, but really doesn't get the more mainstream love that it deserves. But yeah, outside of that, just supporting. We're always looking at new specifications and keeping our eye on the radar of things that we can ship that makes not only your life as a developer easier, but the lives of your developers under them, your users, your customers, and making it easy to adopt your services. I think those are off the top of my head.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think we can call it a wrap today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and walking us through these tools and how they're interconnected as well. It's a great workflow that we put together, I think, for this event. I'm just going to cap things off with just 2 very quick messages about Nordic APIs. If you liked any of this content, check out the Nordic APIs blog. We're putting out a handful of thought leadership style pieces that are covering new trends in the API economy every week. And then I put together a digest that looks at these every other week as well. So check out the Nordic APIs blog for more API specific insights on development, security, new designs, and different description languages, and more. Also, the Platform Summit, our flagship yearly event held in Stockholm in October, is happening once again this year. We're about to get the final agenda together, and we're still looking for a couple more speakers. There's a couple more sponsorship opportunities for the event. And of course, registration is already open. You can check out the website or just search Platform Summit 2024 to learn about who's speaking this year and what topics might be covered. So that's all I have for you. Thank you so much to Dan and Cameron for coming in for this event, and to everyone who watched. See you at the next one. Thank you.